let's jump right into a descent into pure, unfiltered intellectual vanity. In today's explainer, we're tracking a really terrifying psychological journey. It's a grim, dark fable known as the shadow of the Übermensch. We are going to explore the extreme, frankly devastating lengths the human ego will go to just to avoid the brutal truths of reality. Listen to this absolute mockery echoing from the high palace of aesthetic detachment. Quote, "Why do you recoil from the bone-white dust of becoming?" That is the jester, and he's hurling this impassioned diatribe at a fundamental human cowardice, our absolute refusal to engage with the messy, painful, constant evolution of actual existence. Which naturally brings us to a chilling question. Think about this for a second. What actually happens when an intellect purchases a deed to a world that it has no life left to govern? That is the ultimate catastrophic cost of fleeing the dirt and hunger of reality in favor of some sterile, detached purity. So the catalyst for this whole tragedy is something called the ink blot. Picture a figure known as the Last Man. He's huddled away in a city of gilded cherubim, desperately clutching his ancestral myths because the stars are outright refusing to align with his sacred drawings. And then, suddenly, this viscous manifestation of negation just seeps into his vision, forcing a profound, involuntary psychic regression upon him. Now, this disruption triggers what's called an atavistic fall. And to be clear, this isn't some heroic leap forward into an enlightened future. No, it's a psychic regression deep into the deepest caverns of repressed terror. Instead of birthing a pioneer of the open horizon, this plunge twists the ego into the shadow of the Übermensch, an entity that is just completely consumed by a Luciferian pride. We can actually map out this tragic fable using a Fichtean dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The journey tracks from the regression of the inkblot all the way up the arrogant, unmapped peak, and finally to the terminal horizon, which is the absolute dead end of the ego. Let's start with our thesis, the Luciferian pride. So the shadow begins its ascent up this unmapped peak, but not to measure the landscape. No, it climbs to literally blot out the stars with the ink of its own arrogance. It's seeking a fake divinity, one that completely sidesteps the surgical pain of the philologist's jagged quill, which would uncover the very human hands beneath our holy scripts. The shadow essentially demands a throne of pure light, totally detached from the cold, barren story of limestone and reality. And honestly, we kind of all do this sometimes, right? Retreating into our optimized little digital bubbles to avoid the messiness of life. But the shadow takes this to the absolute extreme. It looks at nature's indifference and sees a structural punishment, deciding it would literally rather be a smiling corpse than endure the soul-stripping process of actual messy living. But, as we know, every thesis demands an antithesis. Enter the red specter. This is a violent, intensely vitalizing reaction against the absolute sterility of the shadow. Where the shadow retreats into nothingness, the specter attacks. The philosophical conflict here is incredibly stark. On one side, you have the shadow's pride, this desperate, clutching desire for a detached, sterile divinity. On the exact opposite side, you have the red specter's chaos. The specter demands that we write with blood. It actively embraces suffering, dirt, and hunger as the sacred, vitalizing ingredients of creation itself. It is the ultimate showdown, intellectual sterility versus chaotic, bloody existence. And this cowardice from the shadow inevitably leads to the stroke of the great noon. The vertical, absolutely unforgiving light beats down, stripping away all the comforting illusions to reveal the empty apotheosis. The sheer vanity of the shadow's sterile pursuit is exposed in the harsh light of day, because there is no triumph here. There's just a void. The horrifying result of all this is captured by a single digit, 0. That's the ultimate dark punchline of this fable. The self hasn't been elevated into a god at all. It has worked tirelessly, scraping away every last piece of its own humanity, just to be optimized into a perfect, silent 0. The shadow is nothing more than a static monument to an unlived life. This right here is the fetish of form. Frozen in an optimized eternity of nothingness, the shadow entirely lacks the courage to write a new law upon the blank vellum of existence. So instead of engaging in the active, joyful process of continuous self-creation, it just becomes a static registry of cost. It tragically, pathetically mistakes the thermal volatilization of its own identity for the dawn of a sovereign future. It is the absolute tragedy of an unowned mind, hearing the vanishing remnants of its old self crying out that it just bought a world it can no longer govern. Which finally brings us to the synthesis, the inevitable, violent collision point, the uncanny mirror. Having fled reality and optimized himself all the way down to zero, our warrior of purity arrives at this gateway. It is the ultimate threshold of his own repressed terror. Inside the glass, the original ink blot pulses. It pulses with the frequency of ancestral vows that were burned in vain, without ever once reaching the bedrock of existence. The mirror reveals this horrifying landscape of desiccated riverbeds devoid of any blood or vitality, completely unmasking the forgeries of his pride. By seeking to be a detached, perfect entity, the pioneer realizes, way too late, that he is merely a broken ornament on the neck of a dead god. Just listen to the Wanderer. Scraping moral paint from the bone-white desert, he asks, "Is your sovereignty merely a flight from the winter reality?" That question perfectly encapsulates this spiritual suicide. The pursuit of perfection was never about mastering the world at all. Actually, it was just a cowardly sprint away from the cold, demanding reality of living. So look at your own pursuits. Are you actually mastering the chaotic, demanding, savage route of life? Or are you simply blotting out the stars, flying towards some optimized eternity of nothingness? Because the perfection of nothingness is the absolute law for those who hide from the light. Keep questioning the horizon before you have to face your own uncanny mirror.